Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY. Damian Farrell with Damian on Design each week here on the Lucy Ann Lance Show. We continue in part two of our conversation with Doug Selby with Meadowlark Builders. And last week we got a good idea of how to make an energy efficient home and some of the terminology that goes along with that, with a passive home versus all these other terms that
off the grid.
Off the grid, net zero.
Net zero.
Today we're going to show people how to actually build their own home with these principles in mind. Welcome back, Damian Farrell.
Thank you very much. Welcome back, Doug.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a mindset, a very distinct mindset from the clients that we have seen and talked to who want to do this kind of work. They come with an elevated understanding and a different set of criteria, I think, than most people. That it's much more about, they come with the science as opposed to the design. I think that's a fair assessment to generalize.
Okay.
With this.
So you know what needs to go in there. You know the kinds of things that you want to happen. How do you get there, though? So we need to know the principles, the building principles revolving around this, right?
Yeah, a lot of education, right, Doug?
I think that's the most critical part, and really it's education all the way through the process, you know, including the people who are framing the house and the people who are actually putting the house together have to have some sense of what they're doing because, you know, I remember back in the 90s and the early 2000s where sort of the industry was all centered around, well, you're going to move in 7 years anyway, so build the house as cheaply as you can.
Oh, yeah.
And we used to have what we'd call piece labor back then, which meant that you got paid by the piece of labor that you did,
Right.
which was an incentive for work crews to find ways to cut corners as much as they could to get as much work done and as fast as they could because that's how they got paid. And so really this is about changing that mindset to be like how much quality can we put into the building up front so that this building will last a long time and that you'll be comfortable and healthy and really, really energy efficient during the life of the house.
So before the framing, though, comes the design.
Mm-hmm.
and that's, I think, the most critical part, the kind of house that you're designing to be most efficient.
Well, that is the cheapest place that you can possibly spend money on a house is in the design.
Yeah, and what it means for us as architects is right from the beginning, as you start to literally lay out space, you are taking into consideration openings and windows and kinds of windows.
And positioning of the house. I learned that from you.
Yes, the orientation of the house is extremely critical in meeting passive house standards.
Describe what you're talking about there for our listeners.
So in our environment here in Michigan, you want, in an ideal site, you want an east-west axis. So you want your longest facade south and north.
Okay.
All right. And because the south sun is the easiest one to control with deep overhangs or horizontal overhangs. And you can design the depth of those overhangs to make sure that no sun hits the glass directly in the summertime, but you do bring in some and control it for the wintertime because of the beautiful way our system works, right?
Right.
Steep sun, steep angle in the summer, shallow angle in the wintertime. And then what that does is then you can manage your east and west. East, not so bad. The west is the tough one.
Okay.
And here in Michigan, especially when you're at this end of the time zone, we get these long evenings. Whatever you want to do about the debate on daylight savings. And so you want to look to be sheltering the west and the northwest corner of a house. Natural vegetation is a great way to do that. All right, if you have views and stuff that you want to look at. Then you're left with the north. North is that beautiful soft light that we get here in Michigan, and other than very late in the day and very early in the morning, late in the day in the summertime, you're not going to get any direct sun onto that north facade. So it makes it easy to control. So those are your design parameters.
All right, let's go to what we're putting into the house now, the framing. Talk about that aspect, Doug.
Well, I do want to tag on to what Damian said too, in that I personally believe that the architect is very, very underrated in how a house performs, and that architects are really people need to understand that the design and the planning have as much to do with building a greenhouse as every other step that goes into the process.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes down to specifying the type of lumber that you use and the type of connections that you're going to use, and doing building with what we would call a thermal break. That is to say that there's not building members that go continuously from inside to outside. Wood members, studs and things like that traditionally serve as sort of like radiator fins. In a passive house design, for instance, all of those designs are going to be a high R value that's what we would call thermally broken, meaning there's nothing that can reach from one side to the other without having a high R value material in between them. And it makes a big difference. It also has to do with making an envelope that can't have condensation happening inside the walls, which is, has traditionally been something that causes mold and problems in housing, especially as our houses get tighter. So there's a lot of things that go into a really well-performing wall and roof assembly and foundation assembly, for that matter, too. And so it's, in my opinion, very important for the designers and architects to work in conjunction with the people who are building the house so that you get the best possible envelope.
Are we doing things different with the type of lumber we're using?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're headed more to the engineered lumber, so what people call TJIs, the joists you might have seen, for instance, on your site, where you have what looks like a piece of plywood with two little blocks of wood, one top and bottom,
right,
for the joist. So the engineer, so it's a more green approach because you're taking shorter growth or quicker growth lumber, you're chipping it up, putting polymers and compounds and adhesives into it and making something new as opposed to waiting for trees to get nice and big.
Right.
So the engineered part of it, what that also does is it means we can get much deeper. So now we can use what we've been using for floor joists traditionally. We use those as studs now. All right. So the engineered wood, and that means, it's not just a 2x8 or a 2x10. We have much more, because it's engineered and made in the factory, much more control on so there are standard depths, but we get much greater depths with the engineered lumber, and it's much more true, more predictable.
Absolutely. And the other factor is, we used to build homes out of old growth wood, almost exclusively, really. And now that's not available anymore. And what is available you would certainly not use for framing in a house. But the old growth wood, it was very, very resilient, meaning it could take a beating and it would still be structural. New wood that you can get nowadays, new dimensional lumber, which is not the engineered lumber, has a lot of sugar in it and very, very wide growth rings. And so if that wood gets wet and damaged in some respect, you've got a problem on your hands. And that's why, flashing and airtightness and all those things are so critical these days, because that wood just can't stand up to the type of abuse that it would have if the house was built 50 or 60 years ago.
I know that builders, when the walls don't come together exactly correctly, or there might be a little seam, or that they use some kind of a fill in there. How does that impact what we're talking about with green energy?
Well, that's a good one, because there's a double-edged sword with cork, right? On some hand, on one hand, it's a cover all sins, fill all sins. On the other hand, it does play an important role in working with other materials like taping to make sure that you do not have any of those gaps.
There are many products available too, and having deep product knowledge is critical, because many caulks will be ineffective after 2 years.
Yeah.
Really?
The best thing is not to have those gaps in the first place. Yes. And having been a framer for a few years, I can tell you that framers sort of go in with the mentality of, if one stud is good, 9 are better. And from a building science perspective, nothing could be further from the truth. So you really have to kind of square what the industry standards are versus what the state of the art is in materials and workmanship.
What is cellulose?
Cellulose is ground up newspapers or other print material.
Or jeans, or
that type of fibrous material. It's usually soaked in borates, which makes it not good for mold and things to grow, and also maybe some fire retardants, things like that.
Where does that go?
And that goes in interstitial spaces between the inside and the outside of the wall, or forming a blanket on the ceiling of the top floor of the house as well. You have to be careful with cellulose because moisture can migrate through it. So when we build, I find it to be a perfectly good fill material for insulation. But you do have to be careful that you have no chance for condensation to end up in that assembly, because moisture vapor will move freely through it.
And that's where the science comes in, because the dew points, or the places where moisture will start to form, varies tremendously across the country, right? I mean, so if you go from a hot, dry climate to a climate like Michigan, you have to be very careful about where you put things, and that's very important. So, just to give you a visual illustration of how things are different. So if we look at the traditional wall we're accustomed to, vertical studs, insulation in between them, all right? Now what we're doing, so that's in a vertical plane. Now we're going onto the outside of the building, and we're adding additional insulation, and which is in a sense going cross-grain to what we had done in the past. And so those overlaps are what are contributing to some of these breaking down of air passage through, in addition to the wrap that, for instance, you've seen on your house that continues to be an essential part of it all. So it's these other layers that are being added to now. And Doug's right. I hadn't thought about it. If one stud's good, nine's better. Wood's a good insulator, but it's not as good as some of the new insulation materials. So if you end up with a corner that's got 6 studs going each way, you're actually doing yourself a disservice. So it's about being very careful and being very thoughtful. And
the important thing is you're introducing spots for moisture, and you're introducing spots to lose energy freely if you have too much wood, and most of the time it's actually doing nothing to help the building be structurally more sound.
All right, what other tips do you have for potential homeowners of a new build? What should they be considering putting into their house, into the construction, Doug?
Well, I really think that if you focus on your envelope first and foremost, that's the thing that you can't change in the future.
The design of it, the framing of it.
that's where you got to spend the money. I agree.
Yep. And all the rest of it. I mean, there are hundreds of things after that you can do.
Give us some examples of those.
Well, I would say the next thing after you have a great building envelope is to really look at your heating and cooling system. Is your duct system modeled, computer modeled? Do you have ducted cold air returns? Is the system designed so that you don't that all the everything of the supply and return for each room is appropriate? Are all the transitions in the ductwork sealed? Those types of things. And then what's the power plant? Are you using fossil fuel? Are you using geothermal energy? Are you using air source heat pumps? So these are ways that you can progressively start reducing the cost of the heating and cooling. Next, I would look at hot water. That's a big consumer of energy in a house. How can we make more efficient hot water? How can we have distribution systems for that water that are not only going to make it more comfortable for the homeowner, but in faster hot water and things like that, but also use far less water, which is a precious natural resource as well.
How do you do that? What do you recommend?
Efficient hot water heating is there's many options there, and it depends on the goals for the family. Then there's recirculating hot water, which we do not as a continuous thing, but like you push a button and the water will recirculate a little bit so that you're ready to go, but that it's not continuously like losing energy into the building envelope. And then from there, just a good delivery system for the water, a good low water use delivery system. Typically, PEX manifold system is something we use frequently, which is, PEX stands for cross-linked polyethylene. It's an alternative material to copper and can be very effective. And you can use manifolds at different points of the house so that you can have minimal branch runs to each fixture. Things like that low-flow water fixtures, those things are things that you can reduce your water consumption by 60-70%, and you will not notice a difference as the end user of that.
Are you sure about that?
That old Seinfeld episode where they have the black market shower heads and things like that. Those are common memes in our society. But I have a low-flow shower head that uses very little water, and I love it. I think it works great, and there are no performance problems with it. And those days of having the sacrifice that you would have to make to have something be low energy use or low water use, those days are done. There are great products out there now, and it's just a matter of having the knowledge about what's working.
Doug Selby with Meadowlark and Damian Farrell, local architect with Damian Farrell Design Group. Damian?
There's an interesting shift in the conversation that's going on as well. I've listened to our conversation. Doug and I have each used the word green once, and so have you in this entire conversation. And that was the word that we were all using. And, as people have become more educated, that doesn't resonate anymore. It doesn't grab because it's so wide and it's so undefined. And what is resonating are words like energy efficiency, comfort, healthy environments. And all of this, what we're talking about, play directly into that. You can't do any of the things that are our goals as architects and builders without directly addressing those things. So there are other benefits that are coming along as part of this that are huge, that yes, you're paying more to insulate your house better if you're going for passive, but included in that cost are other huge benefits. So people with sensitivities, with environmental sensitivities, are going to live much healthier lives in these kinds of homes. the way it does and will affect the way you live in your home. Some of the small remodels that we've been involved in, where we're seeing, actually an example you and I both know very well, our good friend John Kotarski, all right, who's done so much to promote architecture and design and art in this town.
He lives in a normal little subdivision of
And
little
we remodeled
houses.
it, right? We added
incredible.
650 square feet to it. But at the center of that, we also did one of the very simple spark fireplaces. Right in the center of the home, that's a very powerful visual element in the house. But I was just there last Friday, and he said that they only turned on their heat, he said, about 5 days this winter that we've had.
Are you kidding?
No, because even as a retrofit, we did tighten up the house tremendously. So we used, in that instance, we didn't even go to cellulose. We did closed cell spray in, so because we were dealing with tiny areas, very compact areas, and so that, and in fact, we're now actually having to do some modifications to the original heating and cooling system, because what is happening, we are getting some moisture forming on the inside surfaces, because the system is not adjusting the humidity of the air enough. It's been accustomed to leaking out or leaking back. But so there's so much more that we can take into consideration now.
That's a good example,
different
though,
words to use.
for people that live in like a 1960s, 1950s traditional Ann Arbor house. There are things you can do to retrofit that to make it more efficient for your family and more comfortable.
So a house like that, from where the fireplace is, there's no point of the house anywhere that's further than 20 feet away.
Yeah.
So it works,
Some great ideas today from two experts in our community here on how to make your home more energy efficient. And it's nice to hear the applications for people to really understand what they need to be thinking about, Doug, on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth going around and taking a look at what's available out there, and really doing some exploring. It's kind of like going and buying a standard house plan on the internet versus having somebody really work with you to determine what's going to be best for you. I find typically that people can reduce the amount of space that they actually need, and therefore greatly reduce the amount of build costs that they have by working with an architect to really wring redundant spaces out and to make sure that what's there is going to perform really well. So to me, again, I just keep coming back to the thing that really getting it right on paper first is the most important thing you can do. And think deeply about the house that you want to live in and what's going to happen in 20 years.
And there are a lot of resources both on Doug Selby's site and on Damian Farrell's site. Doug, for Meadowlark Builders, what is your website?
Oh, I'm sorry, www.meadowlarkbuilders.com.
And Damian says dfdgonline.com.
Yeah.
Great talking with both of you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucian.
The
Thanks,
Lucy
Doug.
Ann
Thank you.
Land Show, Damian on Design each week here on Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY.